Thank you for tuning in to Freeman Press Podcast. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that might seem like something out of the history books. Debtors Prisons.
It's one of those things you think, oh, Dickens, yeah, right.
Right, like a bygone era. But we've got a whole stack of research here, historical accounts, and I got to say, even I was pretty surprised by some of what I learned.
It is kind of wild how this concept we think of with, like I said, Dickens and Victorian England, it still pops up in today's legal system.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Even though debtors' prisons, officially they're unconstitutional, tens of thousands of Americans, they're still being jailed each year because they just can't pay their debts. So by the end of this deep dive, you're going to get a much better understanding of how this system works, what impact it has, and what we can maybe do about it. So let's start with some historical context. Can you kind of walk us through the origins of debtors' prisons, particularly here in the U.S.?
Well, the idea of jailing people for debt, that goes back centuries. But in America, debtors' prisons were really a big deal, especially back in the 1830s. It was a time when being jailed for owing money was more common than being jailed for actual crimes, which is just crazy to think about.
That's just wild. What was the logic behind that system?
Well, the thought was that if you put someone in prison, it would pressure them, force them to pay up, or maybe their family or friends would bail them out. But in reality, those places, those prisons, they were often overcrowded, filthy, disease-ridden. It wasn't about rehabilitation. It was punishment, pure and simple, and it really trapped people in poverty.
Yeah, it's just kind of perpetuating the problem, right?
Exactly. Think about it. If you're stuck in prison, you can't work. So how are you supposed to make the money to pay off your debt? It just prolongs your imprisonment, and the whole thing is designed to keep poor folks in debt forever.
It's just heartbreaking to think about the people who suffered under this system.
Absolutely. There's one story, a guy named Harrison Lane, a Maryland farmer who ended up in jail over some debt. We don't know the exact amount, but he wrote about his experience, and it's just heartbreaking. His so-called friends, they all just vanished, and the people he owed money to, they actually started tacking on more and more expenses while he was locked up.
Wow. They're just profiting off of his misery.
Yeah, pretty much. And, his story is just one of many. Countless people and families suffered under the system for years until finally, around the mid-19th century, both the feds and states started passing laws to get rid of debtors' prisons.
So that's the good news, right? Debtors' prisons they're a thing of the past.
Well, that's where things get a little murky. You see, the traditional debtors' prison might be gone, but what we have now, it's more of a shadow system, It finds loopholes in the law to put people in jail for being unable to pay all sorts of debts. We call this the modern debtors' prison.
But even though it's unconstitutional, we basically got a system that does the same thing.
Basically, yeah. One of the ways they do this is through something called a judgment debtor examination.
Okay, let's break that down. What exactly is a judgment debtor examination?
Well, imagine you get sued for a debt, right? This is a court hearing where you have to go and basically lay out all your finances under oath. They'll ask about your income, your assets, your bank accounts, the whole 9 yards.
So you have to bare your financial soul to the court.
Pretty much. Now here's the catch. If you don't show up to these hearings for any reason, even if you're sick, you can't get a ride, or you got to take care of your kids, you can be held in contempt of court. And guess what? They can issue a warrant for your arrest.
So you could end up in jail even if you have a legitimate reason for not showing up.
It happens all the time, sadly. Back in 2016, judges signed off on over 8,500 arrest warrants just for debt collection proceedings.
Wow. 8,500. That's crazy. What kind of debts are we talking about here? Is it just unpaid loans?
It's much broader than that. We're talking medical bills, student loans, even traffic tickets and bounce checks. Anything, really. Seriously. Bounce checks.
You wouldn't believe it. Even a bounce check for a couple of bucks can land you in this system.
It's like they're trying to squeeze every penny out of you. So what's driving this relentless pursuit of even small debts?
Well, one big factor is for-profit debt collection companies. These guys, they team up with district attorneys' offices using official letterheads and everything, and threaten people with jail time if they don't pay up.
So they're basically weaponizing the legal system.
You could say that. And it has devastating consequences for people and families.
Yeah, I can imagine. Can you talk about what kind of impact the system has on people's lives?
It's a lot. We're talking about people losing their jobs, their homes, struggling with their mental health. It creates this whole atmosphere of fear, especially in low-income communities.
So it's like it's not enough that you're struggling to pay your bills, then the system just piles on even more.
It's a vicious cycle. You're struggling to get by, You get hit with the debt, you can't pay, you end up in this legal mess, and it just keeps getting worse. It's almost impossible to escape. It's just heartbreaking. But are there any solutions? Is there any hope for people who are trapped in this system? Are there any legal remedies they can use to fight back?
There is hope. Thankfully, we have some laws on our side, both constitutional and federal, that can be used to challenge these practices. One of the most important ones is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, or FDCPA for short. This law basically says that debt collectors can't use deceptive or abusive tactics.
So the FDCPA offers some protection against, I don't know, like harassment and threats from debt collectors?
That's the idea, but it's not a perfect solution.
Okay, so it doesn't cover every situation.
Right. There are other state laws and court rulings that can offer some protection too, but the bottom line is, if you're facing this kind of situation, you need to know your rights and get legal help if you can.
So knowledge and legal representation are key.
Absolutely. And I'll give you an example of how these legal remedies can work. There was a case in Massachusetts. A guy we'll call Mr. W. He was facing a default judgment and potential legal action from one of these predatory for-profit education companies. But he got some legal help, and guess what? He was able to get the judgment thrown out and even got a favorable settlement.
So there is hope. That's a good reminder. This has been really eye-opening so far. It seems like these debtors' prisons, they haven't really gone away. They just evolved into something more insidious and often even more effective.
Yeah, it's kind of a chameleon blending into the legal system, and the people who suffer the most are often the ones who are already struggling, you know?
It's a system that preys on the vulnerable. It's just not right.
No, it's not. And that's why it's so important to talk about this, to raise awareness. People need to know what's going on, how this system works, so they can protect themselves.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
The more we know, the better equipped we are to fight back.
You got it. And speaking of the past, you mentioned a story earlier about Harrison Lane in Maryland. Can you tell us more about what happened to him? What does his story reveal about this whole system?
Sure. Harrison Lane's story, it really highlights how even a small debt could completely ruin someone's life back then. He was a farmer, and like I said, he fell behind on his payments, and they threw him in jail in Baltimore County. We don't know the exact amount, but it probably wasn't a lot, especially by today's standards.
So it wasn't like he was some big-time crook trying to cheat people out of their money.
Right. He was just a regular guy facing hard times. And that's what's so important about his story. It shows that debtors' prisons weren't just for the wealthy folks who defaulted on big loans. They were used to punish everyday people who simply couldn't afford to pay their debts.
It's a system that punishes poverty instead of trying to help people out of it. Exactly. And sadly, Harrison Lane's story doesn't have a happy ending. He spent months in jail hoping for some help from friends or family, but like he wrote, his pretended friends abandoned him. And the creditors, they took advantage, charging him all these extra fees while he was locked up.
Wow. It's like they were kicking him when he was already down.
Yeah, pretty much. And that was pretty common back then. The system was designed to trap people in debt, not help them get out.
It's a pretty dark chapter in our history.
It is. But it's a chapter we need to remember so we don't repeat those same mistakes.
Absolutely. Understanding the past can help us avoid making those mistakes in the present.
That's right. We need to challenge any system that criminalizes poverty and instead fight for solutions that create opportunity and justice for everyone.
Well said. We'll be right back after a short break to dive into how this modern debtor's prison operates. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Free Man Press Podcast. Before the break, we were talking about those pretty grim historical debtors' prisons here in America. But let's shift gears a bit now and talk about what's happening today. You know, how does this modern-day debtors' prison system work, especially considering it's supposed to be unconstitutional?
Yeah, it's pretty sneaky how it operates. It's all woven into our legal system, making it tougher to spot and fight against. Basically, it exploits loopholes and legal tricks to get around that whole ban on jailing people for debt.
Can you give us an example, like a real-world scenario of how that works?
Sure, let's go back to those judgment debtor examinations we talked about. Remember, if you don't show up to those court hearings, even with a good reason, they can slap you with a contempt of court charge.
So they're not technically arresting you for the unpaid debt, but for disobeying the court.
Bingo! It's this legal sleight of hand, you know? It lets them sidestep the whole constitutional issue by calling it disobedience, not poverty. And sadly, the courts often have a lot of power when it comes to these contempt charges, and judges often side with the creditors and those debt collection companies.
It's like the system is rigged against those who are already struggling.
You hit the nail on the head. It creates this two-tiered justice system where those without the means to navigate it are at a huge disadvantage. And this disproportionately affects communities of color, reflecting the broader racial disparities we see in our justice system as a whole.
Can you say more about that? How does race play into this?
Well, communities of color are already more likely to be targeted by police. More arrests for minor things like traffic violations or just hanging out in public. And those minor offenses, they lead to fines and fees. And if you can't afford to pay those, boom, you're in that debtor's prison cycle.
So it's like this chain reaction. Minor offense, fines, then because of financial hardship you can't pay, and it just snowballs into this whole mess of court appearances, potential contempt charges, and even jail time.
Precisely. And once you're in that cycle, it's incredibly hard to break free. You might lose your driver's license, your wages get garnished, and good luck finding a decent job with a criminal record. All of this just makes it even harder to pay off your debts and escape the system.
It's this vicious cycle that keeps people trapped in poverty, just reinforcing the inequalities that already exist. This isn't about individual choices, it's about these bigger systemic forces that create and maintain these disparities.
100%. We can't ignore the fact that these disparities aren't just random, they're rooted in deeper structural issues, like poverty, limited access to good education and healthcare, and discriminatory housing policies. These factors make communities of color much more vulnerable to falling into this trap.
So we need to address this from multiple angles. It's not just about fixing legal loopholes, it's also about tackling those broader social and economic conditions that contribute to the problem in the first place.
Absolutely. And a big part of that is raising awareness. A lot of people have no idea this system even exists. We got to shine a light on this modern debtor's prison, show people what's really going on and how it impacts real lives, and work together to dismantle it.
I think that's a great point. Awareness is key. But what about legal reforms? Are there specific changes we could make to close those loopholes that allow this system to thrive?
There are, definitely. One major step would be strengthening the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and making sure it covers all types of debt.
So if the FDCPA covered all debts, that would offer more comprehensive protection to anyone facing debt collection.
That's the idea. We also need to make sure courts are keeping a close eye on how debt is collected, making sure creditors aren't using any shady tactics. We need more transparency, more accountability, and safeguards to prevent people from being jailed just because they're poor.
What kind of safeguards are you thinking of?
Well, things like making sure there are alternative ways to pay, like community service, and making sure no one's thrown in jail without a proper hearing to see if they can even afford to pay in the first place. It's about making sure poverty isn't treated as a crime.
That seems like a much fairer approach. But we also need to address those larger social and economic factors, right?
Without a doubt. Things like investing in affordable housing, expanding access to quality education and healthcare, and creating more economic opportunities for everyone. Those are all crucial pieces of the puzzle.
Those are big changes, long-term solutions that require a lot of resources and political will.
They are, but they're absolutely essential if we want to build a society that's truly just and equitable for all. Dismantling this modern debtor's prison, it's going to take a multi-pronged approach. We got to tackle those legal loopholes and the social and economic factors that feed into the problem.
Speaking of the past, you mentioned a specific case earlier, Harrison Lane in Maryland. Can you tell us more about his experience? What does it tell us about the injustices of this system?
Harrison Lane's story is a powerful example of how even a relatively small amount of debt could ruin someone's life. He was a farmer, and he just couldn't keep up with his payments. So they threw him in jail in Baltimore County. We don't know exactly how much he owed, but it was probably a small sum, especially compared to what we see today.
So this wasn't a case of some wealthy person intentionally trying to avoid their obligations.
Not at all. It was a regular, hardworking person who fell on hard times.
And that's what's so striking about his story. It shows that debtors' prisons weren't just reserved for the wealthy who defaulted on massive loans. They were used to punish ordinary people who simply couldn't make ends meet.
Exactly. It really underscores the point that the debtors' prison system wasn't just about enforcing legal contracts. It was a tool for social control, a way to punish the poor and vulnerable. Unfortunately, Harrison Lane's story doesn't have a happy ending. He languished in jail for months, desperately hoping for help from friends or family. But as he wrote, His so-called friends turned their backs on him, and the creditors piled on even more expenses while he was locked up, taking advantage of his situation.
So they were profiting from his misfortune.
You could say that. It was a common tactic, sadly. The system was often rigged to trap people in debt rather than help them get out. Harrison Lane's case is a stark reminder that the debtor's prison system wasn't merely about enforcing the law. It was about exploiting and punishing the poor. And that's a lesson we need to keep in mind as we work to understand and address the modern-day version of this problem.
His experience really brings to light the human cost of these policies. It's easy to get bogged down in the legal arguments and statistics, but ultimately, this is about real people's lives being destroyed.
You're absolutely right. We need to remember that behind every case, every statistic, there's a human being struggling to survive, a family trying to make ends meet. It's about recognizing the inherent dignity of each individual and understanding that poverty should never be a crime.
Before we move on to talk about potential solutions and remedies, I'm curious if there were ever any arguments made in favor of debtors' prisons, historically or even today.
That's an interesting question. Historically, the main argument was that they acted as a deterrent against fraud, The idea was that if people knew they could be thrown in jail for not paying their debts, they'd be more likely to pay up, and that would keep the economy stable.
So it was seen as a way to hold people accountable for their financial obligations.
Right. But as we've seen, that logic was flawed. A lot of those jailed weren't trying to cheat anyone, they were just poor.
And even in cases of actual fraud, imprisonment might not be the most effective or ethical solution.
Exactly. It often did more harm than good, both for the individual and for society as a whole. As for today, some people might argue that these practices are necessary to enforce court orders and maintain the integrity of the legal system.
You mean upholding the rule of law?
Yeah. They argue that if people can just ignore court summons or refuse to pay fines without consequences, it undermines the whole legal process. But that raises another question. Why is debt treated so differently from other types of offenses? Why is it seen as a moral failing rather than a social or economic problem?
It's interesting how we tend to view debt through a lens of personal responsibility instead of looking at the bigger picture.
It is. And as we've discussed, a lot of people who find themselves caught in this modern debtor's prison aren't intentionally breaking the law. They simply can't afford to comply. It really highlights the need for a more nuanced approach to law enforcement, one that takes into account individual circumstances and makes sure our justice system is fair and equitable for everyone.
So what about legal challenges? Have there been any successful cases that have helped address this issue?
Absolutely. One notable case is Brown v. Plata. It wasn't directly about debtors' prisons, but it had a big impact. It was a class action lawsuit that challenged the inhumane conditions in California's overcrowded prisons. The lawsuit pointed out that a lot of that overcrowding was due to people being locked up for minor offenses, including things like unpaid fines and fees.
So they were focusing on prison conditions, but indirectly addressing the debtor's prison problem.
Exactly. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in Brown v. Plata, saying that California's overcrowding violated the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. They ordered the state to reduce its prison population, and that led to some important reforms, like shorter sentences for minor crimes and more alternatives to prison like community service. This helped to reduce the number of people being locked up for things like unpaid debts.
That's a step in the right direction.
It was a significant victory. It not only highlighted the connection between mass incarceration and the debtor's prison issue, but also set a legal precedent emphasizing the government's duty to ensure humane treatment for all those incarcerated.
It shows that change is possible.
It does. And it underscores the importance of continuing to challenge systems that perpetuate injustice.
Have there been any other cases specifically targeting the debtor's prison issue?
Yes, definitely. There have been a number of class action lawsuits challenging the practice of jailing people simply because they can't afford to pay fines or fees. Many of these lawsuits have resulted in settlements or court orders that require states and local governments to change their practices.
What kind of changes have these legal challenges brought about?
Some key reforms include providing access to public defenders for those who can't afford a lawyer, offering alternative payment options like community service or payment plans, and requiring that judges hold hearings to determine an individual's ability to pay before issuing a warrant for their arrest. These cases are really important because they're setting legal precedents that can be used in other parts of the country to fight against these same practices.
It's encouraging to see that there's growing recognition that this modern debtor's prison is a serious problem, and that legal action is proving to be an effective way to challenge it.
It is. The issue is gaining more and more attention, and these legal battles are paving the way for real change. But there are still challenges ahead. One big one is that our legal system is so fragmented. Every state and locality has its own laws, and that makes it hard to implement broad reforms.
So it's not enough to just change federal law. We need to address this at the state and local level as well.
You're right. It's going to take building coalitions and mobilizing people across different jurisdictions to really make a difference. And of course, we're going to face resistance from those who benefit from the current system. The debt collection industry is huge and powerful, and they have a lot to lose if things change.
So we're up against both a complex legal system and entrenched economic interests.
That's the reality. But this modern debtor's prison is a stain on our democracy. Dismantling it is a matter of basic fairness and human decency.
You mentioned earlier that the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA, is a key tool in this fight. Can you tell us more about how this law works and what its limitations are?
Absolutely. The FDCPA, it was passed back in 1977, and it was designed to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, and abusive debt collection practices. It's been a landmark piece of legislation giving people some real relief from harassment by debt collectors.
It sounds like it's been around for a while and has had a positive impact.
It has. But like any law, it's not perfect, and there are some gaps in its coverage.
Okay, so what exactly does the FDCPA prohibit? Can you give us some examples?
Sure, it covers a wide range of abusive practices. For instance, debt collectors can't call you at crazy hours like in the middle of the night. They can't use foul language, lie to you about what you owe, or threaten you with violence or legal action they're not actually allowed to take.
That's good. It sounds like it offers some pretty comprehensive protections.
It does. But it's important to note that the FDCPA only applies to third-party debt collectors. It doesn't cover the original creditor. So, for example, if you owe money to a credit card company, the FDCPA doesn't apply to their collection efforts unless they hire a separate agency to collect the debt.
Ah, so that's a potential loophole.
Yeah.
What other limitations does the FDCPA have?
Well, one big criticism is that it doesn't cover all types of debt. Student loans, which are a huge burden for so many Americans these days, aren't covered. So if you're facing harassment from a student loan collector, the FDCPA doesn't offer any protection.
That's a big gap, especially considering how much student loan debt people are carrying these days.
It is. The FDCPA also doesn't apply to debts owed to the government, like unpaid taxes or traffic tickets. And as we've discussed, those kinds of debts can often land people in that modern debtor's prison scenario.
So even though those debts can have serious consequences, the FDCPA doesn't apply.
Right. Another challenge with the FDCPA is enforcement. The law relies on individuals to file complaints and take legal action against debt collectors who violate it. But that can be really daunting for someone who's already struggling financially. A lot of people just don't have the resources or legal knowledge to navigate the system.
So while the FDCPA is a valuable tool, it's not a perfect solution.
Exactly. No law is perfect. But it's a crucial step in the right direction, and it has helped a lot of people.
Are there any efforts underway to strengthen the FDCPA or address some of these limitations?
Yes, definitely. There are ongoing efforts to expand its coverage, to include all types of debt, and to make it easier for people to enforce their rights under the law.
It's good to hear. It sounds like there's hope for making the FDCPA a more powerful tool for consumer protection. So we've talked about the legal side of things. Are there any other approaches outside of the legal realm that could be effective in tackling this problem?
There are, absolutely. Legal reforms are essential, but they're only part of the solution. We also need to address the underlying social and economic factors that contribute to this problem. It's about changing the systems that create poverty and inequality, not just changing the laws.
So what might that look like in practice?
One key step is promoting financial literacy and education. If we can give people the tools and knowledge they need to manage their money effectively, to understand things like budgeting, credit, and debt, and to avoid predatory lending practices, we can help prevent people from falling into debt in the first place.
So early education and prevention are key.
Exactly. We also need to tackle the issue of income inequality. Policies that promote a living wage, expand access to affordable health care, and invest in early childhood education, all of these things can help reduce income inequality and the problems that come with it, including the debtor's prison cycle.
Those are all important steps towards creating a fairer and more just society, one where everyone has a real opportunity to thrive. It's about creating a safety net that prevents people from falling through the cracks.
You got it. And we can't ignore the role of systemic racism in this whole issue. As we've discussed, communities of color are disproportionately targeted by this modern debtors prison system. Addressing that means dismantling the systems that perpetuate racial inequality.
So it's not just about individual financial choices. It's about recognizing the larger forces at play.
Absolutely. To truly address the debtors prison issue, we need to address the issue of racial justice as well.
That's a powerful point. The fight against the modern debtors prison is intertwined with the fight for social and economic justice.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that everyone has a fair shot at a decent life, where poverty isn't criminalized and debt isn't a life sentence.
Besides working towards these big systemic solutions, are there things individuals can do to protect themselves from becoming victims of this system?
Absolutely. While we fight for those big changes, there are steps you can take to reduce your risk. One of the most important is knowing your rights. Familiarize yourself with the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act and your state's laws.
Where's a good place for people to find information about their rights?
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a great website, and there are also legal aid organizations that can provide information and resources.
So there's no excuse for not doing your homework and understanding your rights.
Right. Another crucial step is to be proactive about managing your debt. Don't ignore bills or collection notices. If you're having trouble making payments, reach out to your creditors and try to work out a payment plan.
So communication is key.
It is. Creditors are often willing to work with borrowers who are making a good faith effort to repay their debts. If you can't reach an agreement with your creditor on your own, consider seeking legal assistance. A qualified attorney can help you understand your rights, negotiate with creditors, and explore other options, like bankruptcy.
Don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it.
That's right. There's no shame in getting legal advice, especially when dealing with a complex issue like debt collection.
And what about those judgment debtor examinations? What should people do if they get summoned to appear at one of those hearings?
Whatever you do, don't ignore it. Failing to appear can have serious consequences, including a possible arrest warrant. As intimidating as it might feel, it's essential to show up.
So face it head on. What can people do to prepare for these hearings?
Gather all your financial documents, like pay stubs, bank statements, tax returns, anything that shows your financial situation. If you can't afford an attorney, try contacting a legal aid organization. They may be able to help.
That's good advice. Even if you're struggling financially, there may be resources available to help you access legal representation.
Exactly. And never forget, you have rights. Don't be afraid to stand up for them. Knowledge is power when it comes to navigating this modern debtor's prison. The more you understand your rights and how the system works, the better equipped you'll be to protect yourself.
That's a powerful message. And it echoes what we've been discussing throughout this whole episode. It seems like we've covered a lot of ground, from the history of debtors' prisons to how they operate today. And it's clear that this system is disproportionately impacting the most vulnerable people in our society.
You're right. This system thrives in the shadows. And one of the first steps to dismantling it is to drag it into the light, to expose how it works and raise awareness. Only then can we start to challenge the injustices of this modern debtor's prison.
This has been an incredibly informative conversation. Before we wrap up this part, I'm curious to learn more about the specifics of how this system targets and punishes people for being unable to pay their debts. We've talked about judgment debtor examinations, but are there other legal tools or tactics they use?
It's a complicated web of legal procedures, which is what makes it so hard to understand and fight against. But if we want to effectively challenge the system, we need to understand how it works.
Okay, so let's break down some of those specific mechanisms. Where should we start?
Well, one common tactic is wage garnishment. Basically, this means a portion of your paycheck is withheld to pay off a debt.
So creditors can literally take money directly out of your earnings.
Yep. While wage garnishment can be a legitimate tool for debt collection, it's often abused. Creditors might garnish an excessive amount of wages, leaving people with barely enough to cover their basic needs.
Essentially pushing them further into poverty.
Exactly. It makes it even harder for them to pay off their debts, creating a vicious cycle. And this practice tends to hit low-wage workers the hardest, people who are already struggling to make ends meet.
So it's like they're being punished for being poor.
In a way, yes. Fortunately, there are federal and state laws that limit how much of your wages can be garnished. These laws offer some protection, but enforcement can be inconsistent, and some creditors find ways to get around them.
So it's a system ripe for exploitation.
Sadly, that's true. If you think your wages are being unfairly garnished, it's crucial to know your rights and seek legal assistance. Another common practice is bank account levies.
Okay, what's a bank account levy?
It's a legal process that lets creditors take money directly out of your bank account to pay off a debt.
So they can basically clean out your account?
Yeah, pretty much. And that can be devastating, especially if it leaves people without money to pay for basic necessities like rent or food. The problem is that creditors sometimes issue these levies without proper notice or without checking if the funds in the account are protected from seizure.
So they're not following the proper legal procedures.
Right. And that can leave debtors in a really tough spot, especially if they're relying on those funds for their everyday survival. Luckily, there are federal and state laws that protect certain types of funds from being seized, like Social Security benefits or veterans benefits.
So there are some safeguards in place, but it sounds like it's up to the individual to know their rights and make sure they're protected.
That's a crucial point. You need to know what funds are exempt from seizure and be ready to seek legal help if a creditor tries to take money that's protected. A lawyer can help you challenge the levy and protect your assets.
So it's another situation where knowledge is power.
Absolutely. We've talked about wage garnishment and bank account levies. Another tactic they use is property liens.
Okay, what's a property lien?
It's a legal claim against your property, like your house or your car. It gives the creditor the right to seize and sell that property to pay off your debt.
So they could potentially take your home or your car.
It's possible, yes. And that can be incredibly disruptive. Imagine losing your home or being left without transportation. It's a nightmare scenario for many people. The problem, again, is that these liens are sometimes placed on property without proper justification or without following the proper legal procedures. It's another way the system can trap people in a cycle of debt.
It sounds like a misuse of the legal system to take advantage of people who are already struggling.
It can be. There are laws that protect certain types of property, like homestead exemptions that protect your primary residence. But it's important for debtors to understand these laws and to be prepared to seek legal help if they believe their property is being unfairly targeted.
So there's a recurring theme here. Whether it's wage garnishment, bank levies, or property liens, knowledge is your best defense.
Absolutely. The more you understand your rights, the better equipped you'll be to protect yourself from this modern-day debtor's prison. That's why raising awareness and educating people about these practices is so vital.
It's about empowering people to fight back.
Exactly. We've talked about a range of legal tactics used in this system, but it's important to remember that there's also a psychological component to it. Creditors and debt collectors often use manipulation and intimidation to pressure people into paying.
Can you give us some specific examples of these psychological tactics?
Sure. One common tactic is creating a sense of urgency and fear. They'll use threatening language, suggesting that if you don't pay immediately, you'll be arrested, your wages will be garnished, or they'll take your property.
So preying on people's anxieties when they're already vulnerable.
Exactly. It's a very effective strategy, unfortunately.
It almost sounds like a form of psychological warfare.
You could say that. Another tactic is to try to shame people about their debt, implying that they're irresponsible or lazy. This can be really damaging to people's self-esteem and can make them more likely to give in to the debt collector's demands.
So it's not just about the debt itself, it's about attacking their character.
It is. And it often works because there's so much stigma associated with debt. People internalize that stigma and blame themselves for their financial problems, and that can prevent them from seeking help or asserting their rights.
It's a reminder that debt collection can be a very personal and emotional experience, and some people exploit that for their own gain.
Absolutely. If we can help people understand these psychological tactics, it can empower them to resist those pressures and stand up for their rights.
We've talked about the legal and psychological aspects of the modern debtor's prison. But isn't there also a moral dimension to this?
There is, absolutely. At its core, the debtor's prison raises some fundamental questions about fairness, justice, and human dignity.
So this is more than just a legal or economic issue. It's an ethical issue as well.
Exactly. It forces us to examine how we treat the most vulnerable members of our society, how we balance the rights of creditors and debtors, and what kind of world we want to live in.
So what are some of the moral arguments against the debtor's prison?
Well, one of the most fundamental arguments is that it's simply wrong to punish people for being poor. It might seem obvious, but our legal system often violates this principle. The debtor's prison system disproportionately punishes those who are least able to pay. creating a two-tiered system of justice where the wealthy can easily navigate the legal system while the poor are penalized for their lack of resources.
So it's not just about the debt itself, it's about perpetuating existing inequalities.
Exactly. It goes against our basic values of fairness and equal opportunity.
Are there other moral arguments against this system?
Another key argument is that it violates the principle of human dignity. The debtor's prison reduces people to mere commodities, objects to be exploited and punished based on their financial worth.
It's dehumanizing. It strips people of their inherent dignity.
Exactly. It can lead to feelings of shame, helplessness, and hopelessness. The debtor's prison inflicts real human suffering, not just legal or economic consequences.
It sounds like there's a growing movement for reform in response to these moral and ethical concerns. What are some of the efforts underway to address the debtor's prison issue, both legally and socially?
There's definitely a growing awareness that this is a problem that needs our attention, and there are efforts underway on multiple fronts. On the legal side, we've already talked about some successful legal challenges that have resulted in reforms in certain jurisdictions. These cases are setting important precedents that can be used to fight similar practices elsewhere.
So the legal system is being used to fight back against the legal system.
In a sense, yes. And there are also legislative efforts underway to reform debt collection laws and protect consumers from abusive practices. Some of these efforts are focused on strengthening the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, limiting wage garnishment and bank account levies, and making sure that everyone has access to adequate legal representation. It's about creating a more just and equitable legal framework for dealing with debt.
So the fight is happening in both the courts and the legislatures. What about efforts outside the legal arena?
There's a lot happening on the social level as well. One important area is financial literacy and education. Empowering people with the knowledge and skills they need to manage their finances effectively is crucial for preventing them from falling into debt traps in the first place.
We talked earlier about the importance of early education and preventative measures.
Exactly. We also need to address those underlying social and economic conditions that contribute to the debtor's prison problem. Things like advocating for a living wage, expanding access to affordable housing, and promoting job training and employment opportunities. These are all essential steps.
So we need to recognize that the debtor's prison is a symptom of a much larger problem, poverty and inequality.
You're absolutely right. And to address it effectively, we need a multi-pronged approach. We can't just change the laws. We need to change the systems that create these conditions in the first place.
This has been an incredibly informative and thought-provoking conversation. It's clear that the modern debtor's prison is a serious problem, but it's also clear that there are solutions out there and that progress is being made. Before we wrap up this part of the discussion, I'm curious to hear more about the specific ways creditors use psychological manipulation tactics. You mentioned earlier that they often use language designed to create a sense of urgency and fear. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. They often use threatening language, suggesting that if you don't pay immediately, you'll face dire consequences like arrest or having your property seized. This tactic preys on people's anxieties, especially when they're already struggling financially.
It sounds like a calculated strategy to take advantage of people when they're at their most vulnerable.
Sadly, that's often the case. Another common tactic is to try to shame people for being in debt, implying that they're irresponsible or lazy. This can be really damaging to people's self-esteem and can make them more likely to give in to the debt collector's demands.
So it's not just about the debt itself, it's about attacking their character.
Exactly. And it often works because there's so much stigma associated with debt. People internalize that stigma and blame themselves for their financial struggles. This can prevent them from seeking help or asserting their rights, creating a vicious cycle of shame and silence.
It's a reminder that debt collection can be a very personal and emotional experience, and that some people are willing to exploit that for their own profit.
You're absolutely right. Understanding these psychological tactics is an important step towards empowering people to resist those pressures and stand up for their rights.
So what can be done to address these manipulative tactics?
Education is key. People need to understand their rights and know that they don't have to tolerate harassment or intimidation. They also need to know that there are resources available to help them, like credit counseling agencies and legal aid organizations.
And we need to change the narrative around debt and stop viewing it as a personal failing.
Absolutely. It's often the result of circumstances beyond our control, like job loss or unexpected medical bills.
We've covered a lot of ground in this discussion. From the legal complexities of the modern debtor's prison to the psychological tactics used by some creditors. What are your final thoughts on this issue?
I think the most important thing to remember is that the modern debtor's prison is not just a legal or economic issue. It's a moral issue. It's about the kind of society we want to live in and how we treat the most vulnerable among us.
It's about recognizing that everyone deserves the chance to thrive, regardless of their financial situation.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that debt, in many cases, is not a moral feeling, but a product of systemic inequalities that need to be addressed.
We'll be right back after a short break to continue this important conversation. Welcome back to Freeman Press Podcast. We've been shining a light on the modern-day debtor's prison, a system that, even though it's unconstitutional, continues to affect the lives of so many Americans. Right before the break, we were talking about the psychological pressure tactics used by some creditors and debt collectors to manipulate folks who are already vulnerable. So let's dig into that a little deeper. How can we empower individuals to protect themselves?
The most important thing is for people to understand this. They don't have to put up with harassment or intimidation from debt collectors. Knowing your rights, that's your first line of defense. The Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, that's the FDCPA, it spells out specific protections, and lots of states have even more laws on top of that.
So it really comes down to knowing what you're up against, right?
Exactly. So familiarize yourself with those laws, and don't be shy about seeking legal help if you think someone's stepping over the line. There are organizations out there that specialize in helping people navigate this kind of stuff.
What about the toll this takes on people emotionally? You know, the shame, the fear, the feeling like there's just no way out when you're facing a mountain of debt.
It's a huge problem. Debt can be a deeply personal and emotional thing, and it doesn't help that society often piles on this stigma and judgment about it. But here's the thing. You're not alone. Millions of Americans are dealing with debt, and asking for help, that's not a weakness. That's a sign of strength.
So where can people turn for support if they're feeling overwhelmed by all this?
There are credit counseling agencies. They can give you guidance on managing your debt and setting up a budget. They can even help you negotiate with your creditors and look into things like debt consolidation. Then there are legal aid organizations. They can provide legal help and fight for you if you're dealing with debt collectors who are playing dirty. And don't forget about mental health professionals. They can help you cope with the stress and anxiety that often come with financial problems.
That's good to know. It sounds like there's a whole support system out there for people who need it. But it seems like we also need to change how we think about debt as a society. Stop seeing it as some kind of personal failing.
You're absolutely right. We need to understand that debt is often a symptom of bigger systemic issues like income inequality, predatory lending, and the lack of affordable housing and healthcare.
So it's not always about people making bad choices, right?
Exactly. Life happens. Sometimes, even the most responsible person can get hit with a curveball and end up struggling to keep their head above water.
So while it's important to empower individuals to handle their debt and know their rights, it's equally important to fight for changes that address the root causes of these problems, right?
That's the key. We need to push for policies that promote economic justice, make our society fairer, and ensure that everyone has a real chance to succeed no matter what their financial situation is. That's what we're aiming for. Breaking the cycle of poverty and creating a system where debt doesn't automatically equal a loss of freedom or dignity.
That's a great goal. We've covered a lot in this deep dive into the modern-day debtor's prison. We've exposed how it works, talked about the injustices, and explored what we can do about it. But maybe the biggest takeaway is this. This isn't just about laws and money. It's about human beings. It's about recognizing the basic dignity of every person and building a society that values that dignity no matter how much money you have.
You said it. We can't let a system stand that punishes people for being poor and traps them for things they can't control. The fight for economic justice, that's a fight for basic human rights, and it's a fight we have to win.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of the modern debtor's prison. We've learned about its history, the legal tricks that keep it going, and the devastating impact it has on people and communities. But we've also seen that there are solutions, that there are ways to fight back, and that there's a growing movement working to create a fair and more just system.
It's been a privilege to share these insights with you all. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about this system, the better equipped we are to challenge it and work towards a world where being poor isn't a crime and debt doesn't equal a life sentence.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. And stay tuned for our